Hey guys! Tonight, we're diving into a world so strange and intense, you probably wouldn't last a day there, let alone a week. Imagine stepping into the heart of the Aztec Empire, a world where gods demand blood. Every corner seems to hide a dangerous ritual, and survival is an art form in itself. The heat of the sun, the smell of burning incense, the constant clamor of a busy civilization. It's all here, and it's as overwhelming as it sounds. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start by understanding just how massive and powerful this empire was. The Aztec Empire, at its peak, was an absolute powerhouse. This was no small tribe in the middle of nowhere. This was a highly organized, intricate society spread across most of central Mexico. Picture this: the great city of Tenochtitlan, their capital, built in the middle of a lake, with causeways and canals winding through it, like something out of a dream. The population? Around 200,000, larger than most cities in Europe at the time. It was a sprawling metropolis, bustling with markets, temples, and warriors. But you wouldn't be a noble or a priest, so where does that leave you? The average person in the Aztec Empire had a life filled with hardship and challenges. Your job might involve farming, building, or working as a craftsman, all tasks requiring physical strength and endurance. But the expectations were nothing short of intense. Your survival depended on keeping up with the rhythm of the empire. There was no stopping. Work was relentless. But that's just the surface. Beneath the constant labor, there was an undercurrent of religious fervor. You'd probably spend more time than you'd like in the presence of the gods, who were very real and very demanding. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs were truly driven by faith, or if their rituals were more about maintaining social order. Some say the gods were the foundation of everything, while others argue that the strict religious systems were simply a tool to maintain control over the people. Either way, you'd be caught in the web of divine expectations with no easy escape. Now, imagine you've stepped out of your humble home, maybe a small hut or a modest stone dwelling. You're on your way to the marketplace or to work. No rush, as everything here seems to move at a slow, deliberate pace. At least that's what you think. But don't get comfortable. The Aztec world isn't about comfort. It's about survival. And while the pace may seem leisurely, you're constantly surrounded by the threat of war, sacrifice, and supernatural forces you can't control. The gods are always watching, always judging, and always demanding. The streets you walk on are not just streets. They're sacred paths. The people you pass aren't just people. They're players in a complex cosmic drama. And every part of your day, whether you realize it or not, has a meaning far beyond your own survival. You won't just eat because you're hungry. You'll eat because it's a tribute to the gods. You won't just work because you need to make money. You'll work because the empire's lifeblood depends on it. And that's just the beginning. As you walk deeper into the heart of this world, you realize that it's not just about getting by. It's about following the rules, the rituals, the traditions that have been in place for centuries. You don't get to decide the pace of life. The gods and the empire do that for you. You're just a small part in a much larger machine. And if you fall out of line, well, you'll find out just how serious the consequences can be. Let's take a moment to explore the Aztec gods. You might think that a pantheon of gods and goddesses sounds exciting, but in the Aztec world, this meant constant pressure to perform. These gods didn't care much for your comfort or happiness. What they wanted was blood. And not just any blood, but human blood. And no, you wouldn't just be a spectator. You'd likely play a role in this. You'd wake up in the morning, knowing that today could be the day you're asked to make an offering to Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, or Tlaloc, the rain god, who required both rituals and, unfortunately, human sacrifices to maintain his favor. And it wasn't just warriors who faced this fate. Anyone could be selected, especially if you were a captive from a nearby tribe. But even if you weren't chosen for sacrifice, life was still an act of devotion. You might be tasked with preparing offerings, crops, animals, or even objects, all of which were meant to keep the gods happy. Historians still argue whether human sacrifice was purely religious or also had practical uses in maintaining control over the population. Some scholars believe it was an actual necessity for the survival of the empire, keeping the gods pleased to ensure good harvests and success in war. Others claim that it was an extreme form of social control, an unsettling but effective method to ensure that the people remained loyal and devoted to the state and its religious mandates. Now, let's talk about the warriors, the true heroes of the Aztec Empire. Warriors were treated like royalty and were revered by all. If you were a warrior, your life would be a blur of training, battle, and yes, more blood. You'd be constantly preparing for the next fight, whether it was to expand the empire or capture prisoners for sacrifice. But let's be real here. You, the regular person, wouldn't stand a chance in battle. Your chances of becoming one of these warriors were slim to none. Instead, you'd likely work as a laborer or a craftsman. You'd be living under the constant threat of war, your life dictated by the needs of the empire and its quest for domination. Every part of your day, every action, would be shaped by the unrelenting pressure to support the war effort and keep the gods happy. And if you weren't actively engaged in work or sacrifice, you'd be attending religious ceremonies, which could take up a huge portion of your life. Every month, there were elaborate ceremonies for various gods, some of which included offerings of food, flowers, and incense. These ceremonies were often accompanied by music and dancing, where you, as a commoner, would be expected to join in and contribute to the performance. The idea was to create a harmonious environment where the gods would feel welcome and, ideally, show their favor on the empire. And let's not forget the capital city, Tenochtitlan, where you would be forced to live in a world of impressive grandeur, but also overwhelming chaos. The city was a massive urban center, filled with temples, marketplaces, and bustling crowds. The streets were lined with vendors selling everything from textiles to exotic animals, and the air was always thick with the scent of incense and cooking food. But beneath the vibrant surface, there was always the threat of violence, both from neighboring tribes and from within the city itself. Historians often debate whether the grandeur of Tenochtitlan, with its floating gardens, grand marketplaces, and impressive temples, was a genuine symbol of the Aztec Empire's might, or if it was simply a carefully orchestrated display designed to intimidate and awe both citizens and foreign visitors alike. You'd never really know if the city's magnificence was the result of divine favor, or if it was all an elaborate spectacle to maintain control over the people. In the end, you would come to realize that in the Aztec Empire, everything you did, from eating to working, from worshiping to fighting, was tied to a much larger purpose. Your life wasn't about personal ambition or dreams of glory. It was about serving the gods, the empire, and the greater social structure that kept everything running. Whether you were a warrior, a priest, or just a humble craftsman, your existence would be wrapped up in the weight of these duties. And if you were lucky enough to survive it all, you'd find yourself taking part in a culture that was as awe-inspiring as it was deeply exhausting. Now that you've gotten a sense of the gods' demands, let's talk about something even more essential to survival: the food, or more accurately, the lack of it. If you think you'd be living in luxury, dining on fine meats and fruits, think again. The Aztec diet, while diverse, wasn't exactly what we would call comfortable by modern standards. At the core of the Aztec diet was maize, corn. And if you couldn't handle corn, well, you probably wouldn't make it. The Aztecs ate maize in almost every form possible: tortillas, tamales, soups, you name it. And while maize was the staple food for the Aztec Empire, it wasn't the most exciting thing on your plate. In fact, you'd be so sick of maize that you might consider yourself lucky if you could eat it with a little chili sauce or beans. You might have hoped for a nice fruit salad with mangoes and papayas, but those were reserved for the elite. For the commoners, you'd be stuck with humble offerings: beans, squash, and maybe a piece of fish or bird if you were lucky enough to catch something. The Aztecs were excellent at growing food, but they were also strict about what food you were allowed to have. And let's talk about those fish. If you lived near the lakes or rivers, you might have had access to fish like trout or bass. But there's a catch. The Aztecs didn't exactly have refrigeration. So, if you weren't able to cook or eat your catch quickly, you'd be dealing with fish that had a strong, pungent odor. To make matters worse, there was a famous Aztec condiment called salsa de chile, chili sauce, that often accompanied these dishes, which meant that any food you ate would likely come with a lingering, burning sensation in your mouth. And it's not just fish. Even their tamales could be spicy and filled with ground-up insects like ants or worms. Historians still argue whether this diet was designed to encourage productivity or simply a necessity born of the limited resources of the land. Some believe that the food choices were tied to Aztec religion and culture, symbolizing the unity of the empire and the harmony of human existence. Others argue that the food served as a reminder of social hierarchy, with the elite eating more delicacies and the commoners enduring a much harsher existence. While this may seem hard to stomach, literally, food wasn't the only thing that the Aztecs were strict about. Their society was built on ritual and ceremony, and food played a key role in that. There were days of fasting and feasts, with grand celebrations where the entire community came together to offer food to the gods. These ceremonial meals, however, were often quite lavish compared to what the common folk had to endure on a daily basis. A particularly delicious part of Aztec life would be the rituals surrounding human sacrifice, which, believe it or not, was often associated with food. When a prisoner was selected for sacrifice, they were treated as a special guest. Before their death, they were given rich foods and offered lavish treatments, probably to make them feel like they were participating in a divine feast. Only, the grand finale was the victim's heart being removed, still beating, and offered to the gods. It's a grim reminder that, for the Aztecs, food wasn't just about sustenance. It was about maintaining the balance between life, death, and the divine. And just when you thought that surviving the Aztec Empire couldn't get any more difficult, there's the matter of the workload. Remember how I mentioned that no one could afford to rest? Well, the Aztecs expected you to work long hours, often in physically demanding jobs. Whether you were working the land as a farmer or crafting items as an artisan, there was no such thing as downtime in Aztec society. And don't get me started on the warriors. Their training was relentless, with constant drills and practices to keep them sharp for war. Some argue that this demanding way of life was the only way to keep the empire running. It's easy to see how the emphasis on hard work and sacrifice shaped Aztec society. But it's also easy to see how it would wear someone down. Add in the pressure of constantly performing religious duties and adhering to the gods' expectations, and you've got a system that was exhausting, both physically and mentally. You'll also quickly realize that no one was really looking out for you in this world. Your role was fixed from the moment you were born. If you were born into a common family, your future was set. Farmer, merchant, artisan. No real room for upward mobility. Not unless you became a warrior and captured prisoners. If you were born to noble blood, your life was slightly more luxurious, but you were still bound by the strict social structure that defined every aspect of Aztec life. Now that you have an idea of the food and work that consumed your daily life in the Aztec Empire, let's dive into something a little more unsettling. The role of sacrifice. Yes, I know what you're thinking. And no, this isn't just something you see in history books or movies. Sacrifice wasn't a rare event in Aztec life. It was an integral part of their religion, politics, and economy. If you thought your day-to-day life was hard, just wait until you realize that one bad day might mean you become the star attraction in a ceremony that ends with you being dragged up the stairs of the Templo Mayor and having your heart ripped out. Here's the deal. The Aztecs believed that the gods created the world, and it was their responsibility to keep the world in balance. They thought that the gods fed on human blood, and in return the gods would give them favorable conditions: sun, rain, harvests. If the gods didn't get their blood, they might, in turn, take away those blessings. For this reason, human sacrifice was performed regularly, and it was done with ceremonial rigor. You wouldn't just be randomly chosen for sacrifice. You'd have a kind of honor bestowed on you, and your death would be a symbol of devotion to the gods. Sacrifices were often prisoners of war, captured from neighboring tribes. But don't think that only prisoners faced this fate. If you were a commoner, and you were unlucky enough to fall into the hands of priests who needed to fill their quota of sacrifices, your life might end as a gift to the gods. The entire process was public, and it wasn't exactly the quick and painless affair you might hope for. No, you'd be led up the Templo Mayor, a massive pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan. There, the priests would stretch you out on the stone altar, cut open your chest with an obsidian blade, and tear out your still-beating heart. The heart was then offered to the gods while your body was discarded, often left to the vultures or other scavengers. Historians still debate the exact number of sacrifices that occurred annually. Some estimates say it was in the thousands. Others suggest that the numbers have been inflated, and that sacrifices were a less frequent event, though still undeniably important. What is clear is that the Aztec people were deeply devoted to the idea of pleasing their gods, no matter the cost. Now, let's switch gears and talk about the warriors. If you thought the common folk had it tough, the warriors were in an entirely different league. The Aztec Empire was a militaristic society, and war was an essential part of their expansion and sustenance. To become a warrior was to gain honor, status, and possibly the chance to capture prisoners for sacrifice. But training was grueling, and the competition to rise through the ranks was fierce. Warrior training started at a young age, usually when boys were around 10 years old. They'd begin their training with simple exercises, learning how to wield weapons like clubs, spears, and the macuahuitl, a kind of sword with obsidian blades. From there, they'd move on to more advanced tactics, like ambushes, siege warfare, and close-quarter combat. There were also ceremonial aspects to being a warrior. Warriors wore elaborate costumes made from feathers, jade, and gold, and they adorned their bodies with tattoos that symbolized their achievements. These tattoos, however, weren't just for decoration. They were a sign of status and skill, marking a warrior as someone who had been successful in battle. But let's not sugarcoat things. Being a warrior didn't just come with glory, it came with constant risk. Every time you went into battle, you were putting your life on the line. And for what? Land, tribute, and the gods' favor. The life of an Aztec warrior was brutal. If you survived, you gained fame. But if you fell in battle, you were no different than a prisoner about to be sacrificed. Warriors were ranked by how many prisoners they captured. The higher your rank, the more honor you were given. To become a Tlachtecatl, a high-ranking warrior, you had to capture at least 4 prisoners in battle. These prisoners would be used in rituals, but they were also a sign of the warrior's prowess, the prize for becoming a Tlachtecatl. A life of privilege, but still subject to the gods' demands, the same gods that might demand your life in the end. The Aztecs believed that the captured prisoners' souls would help the gods fight their eternal battles, and that's why they were so valuable. War, death, and sacrifice were all intricately tied to their belief system. You might not make it out alive, but your sacrifice would have meaning, and it would serve the greater good. Imagine living in this world, where every day was an opportunity to either rise through the ranks or fall victim to the gods' whims. It wasn't a world for the faint of heart, and it certainly wasn't a world where you could afford to be lazy or indecisive. Survival meant understanding your role in the grand tapestry of Aztec life, whether as a laborer, a priest, or a warrior. You had to keep your wits sharp, your body strong, and your dedication unwavering. Let's now look at the everyday life of the Aztec people. You may have imagined that the Aztecs lived in a constant state of drama, filled with blood sacrifices and warfare. And, well, that's mostly true. But life, for most people, was far more mundane than you might expect, if you could call a life that included constant work, limited food options, and occasional divine threats mundane. First off, you'd spend your days either working the land, crafting goods, or selling items in the bustling markets. The Aztec economy relied heavily on trade, and markets like the one in Tlatelolco, which was one of the largest in the world at the time, were integral to daily life. As a commoner, you'd likely be a farmer or a craftsperson. The farmers grew maize, beans, squash, and other staples, all of which were essential to the Aztec diet. If you lived in the capital, Tenochtitlan, you might be part of a more specialized trade, such as pottery or textiles. But no matter what your trade, it would be long hours of work. In Tenochtitlan, the streets would be crowded with people moving from one market stall to the next, exchanging goods like jade, cocoa, cotton, and even exotic items like feathers from tropical birds. But you wouldn't be trading in coins. Instead, you'd use cacao beans or huitzil, small woven bags of goods, as currency. The Aztecs were masters of bartering, and every transaction was a negotiation of value. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs used money in the traditional sense, or if their bartering system was more sophisticated than we give it credit for. Some believe their barter system was just as efficient as any coin-based economy, while others argue that it relied too heavily on human labor and was thus incredibly inefficient. You'd spend your evenings in a similar state of routine, eating your humble meal of maize, beans, and perhaps a bit of fish or poultry, depending on your luck. If you were fortunate enough to live near the lakes or rivers, you might even have access to fresh fish, though you would also be living with the constant smell of the lake, wet, fishy, and somewhat unpleasant. No one had refrigeration, so everything had to be eaten quickly. Even the more luxurious food, like chocolate, was often consumed in its raw form, leaving a bitter aftertaste. But food wasn't the only thing on your mind. Your family structure would be unlike the nuclear families we think of today. In Aztec society, family units were incredibly important, but they often extended far beyond the immediate family. You could have multiple wives, depending on your status, and the family would often work together in one profession, whether farming, crafting, or trading. Children were trained in their family's trade from a young age, and you could expect them to contribute to the household as soon as they were old enough to help. In terms of religion, there was little room for personal belief or choice. If you were a member of the lower classes, you would likely not be involved in the high priesthood, but religion still permeated every aspect of your life. Festivals dedicated to the gods would dominate the calendar, each one marked by massive communal activities, sacrifices, and rituals. You would attend these festivals, pay homage to the gods, and pray for the well-being of your family and the community. You wouldn't get to choose which god you prayed to either. The gods were constant, demanding attention at all times. Historians often debate the degree to which the Aztec religion and social practices were a form of control. Some believe the elaborate religious rituals kept the population in line by providing both a sense of purpose and a means of control, while others argue that the ceremonies were simply a way to unify the people under a common cause. Either way, it's clear that religion was an inescapable part of daily life in the Aztec Empire. But as you trudge through this daily grind, there's something else to consider: the city of Tenochtitlan itself. This place wasn't just a capital, it was a living, breathing entity. The city was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and it was connected to the mainland by 3 massive causeways. The city was carefully designed with canals for transportation, massive marketplaces, and temples. Every building was crafted from stone or adobe, with intricate carvings that depicted the gods, the cosmos, and the ruling class. The city was home to almost 200,000 people, which made it one of the largest urban centers in the world at the time. There were enormous pyramids, bustling markets, and impressive public works. But this wasn't a city that made it easy to move around. Streets were crowded, canals were busy with canoes and boats, and everything was designed to bring people closer to the gods. No matter where you went, you would always be reminded of the empire's divine purpose. This was no peaceful paradise. The city was designed to reflect the Aztec worldview, one of constant motion, competition, and conquest. There was no time for rest, and no real way of escaping the empire's will. The city had its own rhythm, and you were expected to follow it. You would walk through the city's bustling streets, seeing people rushing to markets, to temples, to work, and to the military barracks. You would hear the sounds of drums, the calls of merchants, and the occasional shout of a warrior as they prepared for battle. The very air would be thick with activity. But despite the chaos, the Aztec Empire managed to thrive. While it might have seemed like a constantly boiling pot of tension, in many ways it worked. The rulers kept the empire in check with their complex systems of tribute and taxation, and the religious systems kept the people united under one belief. There were moments of peace, of course, but even in those moments, you couldn't fully escape the intensity of the culture. It was a world that didn't allow for hesitation, for idleness, or for mistakes. Historians still argue whether this intense structure of society was a sign of a well-organized, prosperous empire, or whether it was the precursor to the collapse of the civilization. Did the Aztecs truly thrive because of their rigid hierarchy and constant religious devotion? Or did the pressures of their way of life eventually lead to their downfall? You wouldn't last long enough to find out. Now that we've explored the daily grind and the ceaseless rhythm of the Aztec Empire, let's delve into their military life, a crucial pillar of their power. If you thought farming, crafting, and dealing with endless ritual was demanding, then you'd be thoroughly overwhelmed by what it meant to be a soldier in the Aztec world. The warriors of the Aztec Empire were a class unto themselves, and to be one was an honor. The military was central to Aztec society, and there were countless rules, rituals, and expectations that governed every aspect of warfare. The Aztec warriors, called eagle warriors or jaguar warriors, were highly trained and fierce. These elite warriors were honored above all others, and their role in the empire was not only to conquer, but to keep the gods happy by supplying them with prisoners for sacrifice. As a commoner, however, your chances of becoming one of these elite warriors were slim. But don't worry. Even if you weren't fighting in battle, you'd still play an important role in the military infrastructure of the empire. Most men in the Aztec world went through military training from a young age. Children were trained in combat, tactics, and the use of weapons, and they were expected to become warriors by the time they reached adulthood. Let's say you were one of the lucky ones, and you became a warrior. Well, your life was about to get a whole lot tougher. Every battle you fought would be a struggle for survival, and it was a harsh reality to face. Combat wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about capturing prisoners to be used in religious ceremonies. This meant that warriors would often fight in brutal, drawn-out skirmishes where they captured, rather than killed, their opponents. If you managed to capture enough prisoners, you could rise in status within the military and become one of the highly respected Eagle warriors. But remember, your job wasn't done after the battle. You'd need to present your captured prisoners to the priests for sacrifice. This was the only way to please the gods. Historians still argue about the ethics and true motivations behind the Aztec way of waging war. Some suggest that the empire was built on constant warfare to maintain control, while others claim it was simply a cultural necessity to maintain religious rituals. But either way, you couldn't escape the reality that every battle had a very real purpose: to feed the gods and secure the empire's survival. There was no room for hesitation. You either fought or you were considered a failure. As a warrior, you'd wear ornate armor made from wood, feathers, and leather, designed not only to protect you in battle, but also to display your rank. But even if you survived the wars, you wouldn't exactly be safe. The Aztecs had a complex social structure, and warriors, while respected, still faced strict rules that governed their behavior. For example, a warrior who had captured a prisoner was expected to go through a series of rituals, including bathing and offering prayers, before presenting their captive to the gods. The tension between pride, honor, and fear of divine punishment was constant. Let's step back for a moment and think about the sheer scale of warfare in the Aztec world. Wars weren't just local affairs. They were expansive, involving many different tribes and regions. The Aztecs practiced a form of conquest that focused on expansion, and their warriors were crucial to this. To keep the empire thriving, the Aztecs needed not only to capture more land, but to acquire more prisoners to sacrifice. The more prisoners they captured, the more powerful they became in the eyes of the gods. This brutal logic shaped every aspect of their military life. And while warriors lived with the constant threat of battle, they were also expected to participate in other aspects of the empire's rituals, like ensuring that the gods were properly fed and pleased. The role of a warrior wasn't just about fighting. It was about serving the gods. A warrior's status was measured not just by how many enemies they killed, but by how many prisoners they captured for sacrifice. This made every warrior's life a careful balancing act between violence and religious devotion. But if you weren't a warrior, you might still find yourself caught up in the war effort. As a commoner, you might be recruited to work on the front lines or support the warriors in some way. If you were lucky enough to escape the bloodshed, you might be tasked with making weapons, repairing armor, or gathering provisions. These jobs were just as important as the ones given to the soldiers, and every part of Aztec society was intertwined in a network of military and religious duty. Historians have long debated the effectiveness of the Aztec military system. Some argue that it was one of the most efficient and powerful armies of the time, able to conquer vast territories and expand the empire's reach. Others suggest that the constant need for war and sacrifices may have drained the empire's resources and eventually contributed to its downfall. Either way, it's clear that the Aztec military was integral to the empire's success and failure. Now that we've navigated the intense demands of war and sacrifice, let's take a moment to examine something that, on the surface, might seem much less intense: education. But don't be fooled. In the Aztec Empire, education was just as rigorous and carefully structured as their military training or religious ceremonies. And depending on your social status, it could be both a privilege and a burden. If you were born into a noble family, you'd have access to one of the most prestigious schools in the empire, the Kalmakak. These were elite schools for the children of the noble class, where you would study everything from history, religion, and law to music, poetry, and military tactics. Your education would be guided by strict discipline and could take years to complete. At the Kalmakak, you'd learn the intricacies of Aztec law, the sacred rituals, and the art of diplomacy. In other words, you'd be prepared to rule, or at least to manage a significant portion of Aztec society. On the other hand, if you were born into a commoner family, you'd attend a Telpochkali, a school designed for commoners, particularly warriors and artisans. While it wasn't as prestigious as the Kalmakak, it still involved a demanding curriculum. You'd focus more on practical skills, learning the art of warfare, religious rituals, and trades like weaving or pottery. You'd still study religion, but it would be less about the intricate ceremonies and more about the basic teachings that everyone needed to follow. The commoners were just as important to Aztec society as the elites, but their training was focused on keeping the wheels of the empire turning. Historians still argue whether the strict education system was designed to instill loyalty to the empire, or if it was simply a necessary method for the Aztecs to ensure their complex society operated smoothly. Some scholars claim that the Kalmakak schools were a tool for preserving the nobility's power, while others believe they were a way to ensure the survival of the Aztec religion and culture. It's clear that education in the Aztec Empire wasn't about free thinking. It was about conforming to the needs of the society and the gods. So, what would you experience in one of these schools? If you were lucky enough to be at the Kalmakak, you'd spend long days memorizing religious texts and learning about the Aztec gods. You'd also study astronomy, which was an essential part of the Aztec worldview. Time was seen as cyclical, and the movements of the stars and planets played a major role in determining the fate of the empire. If you were in the Telpochkali, you'd focus on the practicalities of daily life, farming, warfare, and the art of sacrifice. One of the more interesting aspects of Aztec education was the focus on memorization and oral tradition. There were no books like we have today, so all knowledge had to be passed down orally. This meant that students were expected to memorize vast amounts of information, historical events, religious chants, and even the names of the gods. The Aztecs had a complex system of writing, but it was mostly used for recording historical events and religious rituals, not for everyday education. Everything was passed down verbally and was expected to be repeated perfectly. The discipline of the schools was also very strict. Students were required to adhere to a strict moral code, and failure to comply could result in punishment, sometimes physical. If you were a student, you would be held to the same standards as an adult in Aztec society. Your training wasn't just about learning information. It was about preparing you for your role in the world. Every part of your life would be shaped by the expectations of Aztec society. If you were a warrior, your education would be far more physically demanding. You would train in combat every day, learning how to fight with weapons like the macuahuitl, a wooden club embedded with obsidian blades, and the spear. Your training would include running, jumping, and climbing, all in preparation for the grueling battles you would face as an adult. If you were a priest, your education would be focused on the gods, rituals, and the intricacies of Aztec law. And let's not forget the girls. While women in Aztec society didn't have the same educational opportunities as men, they were still educated in a way that prepared them for their roles in society. Girls were expected to learn household duties like cooking, weaving, and caring for children. They also learned about religion, especially the roles of female gods and goddesses, and were often trained in rituals that were performed by women. Women were integral to Aztec society, though their roles were often confined to the home and temple. Historians often debate whether this education system was fair or oppressive. Some argue that it was a way to ensure that everyone knew their place in the hierarchy and could contribute to the empire's survival. Others claim that it was a way to limit individual thought and maintain control over the people. Either way, it's clear that education in the Aztec Empire was intense, structured, and tightly tied to the needs of the empire. Now that you've been trained in the ways of the Aztec Empire, whether as a humble farmer, an artisan, or even a warrior, let's explore what happens when things go terribly wrong. And by terribly wrong, I mean if you find yourself on the wrong end of an Aztec military campaign or facing the judgment of the gods, your fate might be sealed in a particularly brutal way. Let's take a look at what happens to those who are captured by the Aztecs or who simply fall out of favor. If you were unlucky enough to be a captured enemy soldier, your fate would be grim. You wouldn't just be killed. You would be chosen for one of the most sacred and brutal rituals of Aztec society. The Aztecs believed that to please the gods, they needed human sacrifices. And these sacrifices were anything but quick or painless. Captured prisoners would be dragged to the top of the Templo Mayor, the towering pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan. There, they would be laid out on a stone slab, and a priest would cut open their chest with a sharp obsidian blade, removing their still-beating heart as an offering to the gods. And this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a religious ceremony, part of a much larger cosmic order. The Aztecs believed that by offering the blood of their enemies, they could keep the sun moving across the sky and ensure that the world didn't fall into chaos. Historians still debate how many sacrifices actually took place. Some estimates say it was in the thousands each year, but others suggest that the actual number was far lower, with most of the high-profile sacrifices being reserved for special occasions or the most significant conquests. Regardless, if you were a prisoner, the odds of survival were slim to none. You'd be offered to the gods, and the empire would continue on as if nothing had happened. The Aztecs had a very pragmatic view of death. It wasn't an end, but a necessary part of the natural order. But even if you were a citizen, there was no guarantee of survival. If you were a commoner, your life would be governed by a strict set of rules. If you committed a crime or broke one of the many social norms, the penalty could be severe. You could be fined, imprisoned, or even sacrificed. Aztec society was highly regimented, and the punishments were swift and often severe. And let's not forget about the gods themselves. If you angered a god, or if the rituals weren't carried out properly, the consequences could be disastrous. There are records of entire villages being wiped out after failing to properly honor the gods. The Aztecs believed that the gods controlled everything: the sun, the rain, the harvests, and if they weren't pleased, the consequences could be catastrophic. You'd also be subject to the whims of the Aztec military. If you were caught up in one of the numerous wars or skirmishes, there was a good chance that you could end up on the losing side. The Aztecs were expansionists, constantly waging war to expand their empire and acquire more prisoners for sacrifice. If you were unlucky enough to be captured during one of these campaigns, your life would be in the hands of the priests. It's no surprise that the Aztecs had such a fierce reputation for warfare. They needed prisoners to feed their gods, and they needed to expand their empire to ensure their survival. War was a necessary part of their existence, but while war brought them power, it also brought its own set of challenges, like the constant threat of rebellion and the difficulties of managing such a large empire. Even if you didn't face war or sacrifice directly, you'd still be living under constant stress. The Aztecs didn't have the luxury of taking things easy. There was always something to do, always something to sacrifice, always something to please the gods. The rhythm of life in the Aztec Empire was relentless. You couldn't stop. You couldn't take a break. You were part of a much larger system that had no room for laziness or hesitation. Every moment mattered. Historians often debate whether the constant pressure of the Aztec system was what ultimately led to the empire's downfall. Some argue that it was the relentless warfare and the need for constant sacrifices that drained the empire's resources and led to internal strife. Others believe it was the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors that brought about the Aztecs' end. Either way, it's clear that the pressure to maintain the gods' favor, to wage war, and to keep the empire running smoothly was a monumental task. And it's likely you wouldn't have made it through the stresses of daily life without cracking under the pressure. Let's take a breath and move away from the intense reality of the Aztec warriors and their sacrifices, and instead explore something a little less life-threatening, but no less strange: Aztec leisure. It's not all war, sacrifice, and intense religious observance. Believe it or not, the Aztecs had time for fun and games, but even these activities were wrapped up in their worldview, tied to their gods and, of course, laced with competition. First, let's talk about Tlachtli, a ball game that was so much more than just a game. It was a highly ritualistic sport that had deep religious and political significance. Played with a rubber ball, the game was a hybrid of soccer and basketball, where two teams would try to pass the ball through a stone hoop without using their hands. But here's the kicker: the game had real consequences. The stakes weren't just pride. The game was linked to the gods, and depending on the outcome, the losing team could end up as a sacrifice. The game was thought to represent the struggle between the gods of life and death, and losing meant that the gods had taken the life of the players. Now, that's what you'd call high stakes. Historians still argue about the exact role of Tlachtli in Aztec society. Some think it was purely for entertainment, while others believe it was an integral part of religious worship. There's also debate about how often games resulted in human sacrifices. Some sources suggest it was reserved for special occasions, while others claim it was a regular practice. But one thing's for sure. As a spectator, it would have been a thrilling experience to watch the game unfold, knowing that the losing team could face a grim fate. If you were a player, though, you might wish you'd stayed home. If you weren't busy playing Tlachtli, there was always something else to do. The Aztecs had a rich cultural life, with elaborate dances, music, and poetry. As a commoner, you would likely participate in festivals dedicated to various gods, where you dance, sing, and offer food, flowers, and incense in hopes of pleasing the gods. These festivals weren't just about having fun. They were vital to the maintenance of the cosmic order. Even the most basic Aztec festivals were grand events, often lasting days and featuring a mix of religious observances and entertainment. The main festivals revolved around the agricultural cycles, such as the spring and fall harvests, and honored the gods of rain, sun, and fertility. The festival to honor Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun, was especially grand, with plenty of dancing and feasting. But be careful. If you got a little too carried away during one of these festivals, you might just end up in a religious ceremony that you weren't exactly prepared for. But the fun wasn't just reserved for the common folk. The nobles and priests also enjoyed their share of leisure time, though theirs was often more refined. The elite would attend poetry readings, where they would listen to slow, reflective poetry that contemplated the nature of the gods, the world, and existence itself. For the wealthy, leisure meant time spent in the comforts of their grand palaces, relaxing in lush gardens filled with flowers and fountains, often listening to music performed by court musicians. However, even their leisure time was structured and disciplined. Leisure activities in the Aztec Empire were not an escape from life's burdens. They were just another way to maintain balance and devotion. Historians debate whether leisure activities were truly for relaxation, or if they were another way to reinforce the strict social and religious structure of the Aztec Empire. Were the Aztecs just really into their gods and religion? Or did they genuinely enjoy the occasional festival or game? Some believe that their leisure activities, including poetry and dance, were deeply spiritual and connected to their belief in the cosmic order, while others think they were simply opportunities for the elite to display their power and wealth. Either way, you could be sure that any form of leisure was never just for fun. This was a society that didn't believe in wasting time in the traditional sense. Every action had meaning, even when you were simply attending a festival or playing a game. the concept of time in the Aztec world was cyclical and tied directly to the gods' movements in the heavens. Every celebration, every offering, was a way of maintaining balance and pleasing the gods, ensuring that the sun would rise, that the rains would come, and that the harvests would be plentiful. So, if you thought leisure in the Aztec Empire was a casual affair, think again. It was still tied to cosmic forces far beyond your control, and it was still governed by strict rules. And even when you weren't engaging in rituals or military conquests, the overarching theme of survival, respect for the gods, and maintaining order would hover over every moment of your life. No time for rest, at least not the kind we understand today. Now that you've tasted the complexities of leisure, let's take a deeper look at the concept of class in the Aztec Empire. Like many ancient societies, the Aztecs had a rigid class structure that dictated every aspect of your life, from birth to death. There were the nobles, the priests, and then the common folk. And, of course, there were slaves. It wasn't a world that encouraged much upward mobility, so where you were born largely determined where you'd end up in life. At the top of the pyramid, you had the nobility. These were the powerful families, the Pipiltin, who held positions of authority in the empire. They were the warriors, the priests, and the high-ranking officials who made the major decisions. The most powerful among them were the Tlatoani, the emperor, whose word was law. And beneath them were the lesser nobles, those who served as judges, military leaders, and bureaucrats. Their lives were filled with luxury, and they had access to the best food, the finest clothing, and the most beautiful homes. But even the nobility was expected to serve the empire, and their lives were still dictated by the demands of the gods and the emperor. Historians still argue whether the rigid class system was essential for the Aztec Empire's stability, or whether it was a tool for maintaining power among the elite. Some suggest that the social hierarchy was a key factor in keeping the empire unified, with each class knowing its place and responsibilities. Others argue that this structure was inherently oppressive, preventing the common people from rising and contributing to the eventual decline of the empire. Either way, if you were born into the noble class, you had advantages that no one else had, and you were expected to use them to serve the empire. Just beneath the nobles were the priests, who held immense power in Aztec society. Their role was not just to perform rituals and make sacrifices to the gods. They were also the keepers of knowledge. They were the ones who knew how to read the sacred books, who understood the heavens, who could predict the movements of the stars and the weather. They were often involved in the education of the nobility, teaching them about the gods, the universe, and the ways of the world. The priests also had access to the finest food and clothing, and their power was nearly as great as that of the nobility. They held sway over all matters of religion, and their word was often seen as the will of the gods. But no matter how high your rank, everyone in Aztec society had a role to play. The commoners, or Masehualtin, were the backbone of the empire. They worked the land, tended to the animals, crafted goods, and served as soldiers in times of war. They were essential to the empire's survival, but they were also subject to the whims of the nobles and the priests. Commoners didn't have much freedom to choose their path in life. You were born a farmer, you stayed a farmer. Born a craftsman, that's what you would be. And if you were lucky, you might be able to attend a telpochkali, where you could learn a trade or become a warrior. But most of your life would be spent working for the good of the empire. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs practiced a form of feudalism. Some argue that the empire was based on a system of tribute, where commoners worked the land for the benefit of the nobility in exchange for protection. Others argue that it was a highly organized and centralized state, with a strict class structure designed to maintain control over the population. Regardless, the Massahualtan were integral to the empire's success, and they lived under constant pressure to produce for the empire. Then, at the very bottom of the hierarchy were the slaves. These were the people who had fallen out of favor with the empire, or who had been captured in war. Slaves had no rights and were considered property. They were used for a variety of tasks, from working in the fields to serving the noble families. Some slaves were able to earn their freedom by paying off a debt, but this was rare. Slavery in the Aztec Empire was brutal, and while it wasn't based on race like it would be in later societies, it was a reflection of the empire's brutal and hierarchical structure. It's important to note that slaves were not entirely excluded from society. They still had families, and some even had the ability to buy their freedom. But, in the end, their lives were defined by their servitude, and they were at the mercy of the system. What stands out here is that, in the Aztec Empire, social mobility was limited. Whether you were a noble, a priest, or a commoner, your role in society was largely determined by birth. The Aztecs believed in a cosmic order, and your place in society reflected your place in that order. The gods had given you your position, and it was your duty to accept it. Historians argue whether this strict social order was a form of social control, or whether it was simply a product of Aztec cosmology. Some see it as a way to ensure stability and order, while others view it as a way for the elite to maintain their power. Either way, it's clear that the Aztecs took their social structure very seriously, and breaking from it could mean disaster. Let's now look at the darker side of the Aztec Empire: death. You've heard about the human sacrifices and the military conquests, but death is not just something you saw in religious rituals. It was a constant presence in the Aztec worldview, and it affected nearly every aspect of life. The Aztecs believed that death was part of the natural cycle, and that it wasn't something to be feared. The most common form of death in Aztec society, of course, was the sacrifice. But there were other, less glamorous ways to die, too. If you weren't captured in battle or selected for religious sacrifice, you could die from disease, old age, or a number of other factors. But no matter the cause, death was always tied to the gods, the cosmos, and the eternal balance of life and death. The Aztecs didn't just bury their dead in the traditional sense. Their burial rituals were elaborate and symbolic. Depending on the person's social status and cause of death, you could be buried with rich offerings like food, jewelry, and even sacrificial victims. Priests would perform elaborate rituals to guide the deceased to the afterlife, ensuring that they had everything they needed for the journey. But the afterlife wasn't a place of rest. It was a place where souls continued to play a role in the cosmic order, and sometimes they had to continue working to ensure that the gods remained happy. Historians still argue about the specifics of Aztec burial practices. Some suggest that only the most important people were given elaborate burials, while others believe that all Aztecs had similar rites, just with varying levels of luxury. What we do know is that the Aztecs had a deep respect for the dead, and their burial rituals reflected this. For them, death wasn't an end. It was a transformation. But even if you didn't die in battle or in a religious ritual, you still had to deal with the constant specter of death. There were regular festivals dedicated to honoring the dead, like Tzompanku, the Aztec Day of the Dead. This festival, which took place in the month of Micalhuitontli, celebrated the lives of the deceased by offering food, flowers, and incense. There were also offerings to the gods of death, like Mictlantecutli, the god of the underworld, who was believed to rule over the dead and guide them to the afterlife. Historians still debate the exact nature of Tzompanki and whether it was really a joyous occasion or a somber one. Some think it was a chance for the living to reflect on the cycle of life and death, while others believe it was a way to appease the gods and ensure that the dead were content in their afterlife. Either way, it was a time when the Aztecs acknowledged death as a constant presence in their lives. But death wasn't just something the Aztecs feared or respected. It was something they used to maintain their power. For example, when the Aztecs conquered other cities or tribes, they didn't just capture prisoners. They often killed them in elaborate ceremonies to show their dominance. A city's leaders might be killed and their bodies displayed as a warning to others. The message was clear. To defy the Aztecs meant a quick and brutal death. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs used death and sacrifice as a political tool, or if it was simply a religious practice that had political implications. Some believe that the public displays of death helped maintain control over the empire, while others think that the Aztecs were simply very devout and believed in appeasing the gods. Either way, the Aztecs were not shy about using death to assert their dominance, whether through sacrifice, conquest, or public executions. As we continue to explore the empire's inner workings, it becomes clear that death was more than just a final moment. It was a tool that was used to create order and maintain balance in the Aztec worldview. From the nobility to the commoners, everyone was subject to death's presence. And that presence was something the Aztecs learned to respect and manipulate in their own way. So, if you thought you could simply sidestep the whole sacrifice thing and live a peaceful life in the Empire, think again. Whether through warfare, disease, or sacrifice, death was always just around the corner, waiting to play its part in the cosmic order. And that's something you wouldn't have been able to escape, no matter how hard you tried. Now that we've explored death and the afterlife in the Aztec Empire, let's shift gears a bit and look at the larger, more philosophical side of the empire, the very heart of Aztec culture and the driving force behind everything they did, their world view. The Aztecs, like many ancient civilizations, had a highly developed sense of cosmology. Their entire society was shaped by their understanding of the universe, and this worldview governed everything from their religion and politics to the way they interacted with the natural world. The Aztecs believed the universe was a vast and complex system where everything was interconnected, from the gods in the heavens to the people on earth, and even to the plants and animals that shared the world with them. At the center of this worldview was the concept of cosmic balance, the idea that everything had a place, and that the forces of life, death, and rebirth had to be kept in equilibrium. The Aztecs believed that their gods were constantly battling forces of darkness, and it was their job, as the people of the empire, to ensure that balance was maintained through rituals, sacrifices, and observances. Historians still debate the full extent of the Aztec belief system. Some argue that it was a kind of ancient environmentalism, with the Aztecs viewing themselves as stewards of the land and the natural world. Others suggest that it was more about power and control, a means for the ruling class to justify their dominance over the people by tapping into these cosmic beliefs. What is clear is that their cosmology shaped every aspect of Aztec life, from the way they built their cities to the way they waged war. The Aztecs had a detailed understanding of the heavens. Their priests were skilled astronomers, and they used the stars, the sun, and the moon to track the passage of time, predict the seasons, and determine the best times for planting crops and waging wars. The Tonopouhualli, the 260-day sacred calendar, was central to this. It governed everything from the timing of religious rituals to the birth of children, as each day was associated with a different god or force in the universe. These calendars were used to determine everything: your birth, your future, and even the best time to undertake a journey or marry. Every ritual, every festival was tied to the movement of the stars and the cosmic order. This wasn't just about worship. It was about ensuring that the gods were in harmony and that the world didn't fall into chaos. The Aztecs believed that the gods needed their blood to stay strong, and through sacrifices, they gave the gods what they needed to continue the cosmic battles. You might think of these beliefs as superstition or primitive thinking, but for the Aztecs, this was a deeply rational worldview. It was a worldview that made sense to them. Everything, every action, every ritual had a purpose in maintaining the cosmic order, and if you didn't play your part, well, there were consequences, ranging from bad harvests to wars, and possibly even to your own sacrifice. Now, take a moment to think about how this belief system affected the everyday lives of the people. Every part of the day was structured around these beliefs. From the food you ate to the way you dressed, from the number of sacrifices you made to the way you spoke to your gods, everything had meaning. It's a bit overwhelming to imagine, right? The pressure to live in perfect harmony with the universe must have been immense. There was no room for error. The gods were watching, and if you didn't align yourself with the cosmic order, the consequences could be dire. In a way, this belief system also served to justify the Aztec Empire's dominance over other cultures. If the gods had chosen the Aztecs to rule and to maintain the balance of the universe, then it was their duty to conquer and subdue those who stood in their way. War wasn't just about expanding territory. It was about fulfilling the will of the gods. The prisoners taken in battle weren't just captured enemies. They were offerings to the gods, and each one was a step toward maintaining the balance of the universe. Historians still debate how much the Aztec rulers truly believed in their cosmology, or whether it was used as a tool of governance. Some believe that the leaders genuinely saw themselves as the earthly representatives of the gods, while others suggest that they used the belief system to maintain control over their people. Either way, it's clear that the worldview of the Aztecs was an integral part of the empire's success and its eventual downfall. You see, this worldview wasn't just philosophical. It was practical. It determined the timing of wars, the division of labor, and the allocation of resources. It governed the behavior of the people, the rituals they followed, and the duties they performed. Everything was intertwined. The Aztecs didn't just see themselves as part of the world. They saw themselves as part of a much larger, divine plan. And if they didn't do their part, the entire cosmic order could collapse. This worldview was both a source of strength and a potential weakness. It gave the Aztecs a sense of purpose, of unity, and of divine protection. But it also meant that their entire society was vulnerable to the whims of their gods. If the gods were displeased, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Aztecs lived and died by this belief, and as history would show, their empire's fate would be tied to forces beyond their control. Now that you've had a taste of the Aztec worldview, let's move to a subject that ties everything together: rituals and religion. In Aztec society, religion wasn't just an occasional activity. It was the backbone of everything. The gods were everywhere, dictating not only the big events in life like wars and harvests, but the smallest daily rituals too. This deep immersion in religion made every moment feel sacred. And you, as a part of Aztec society, were always reminded of the gods' presence, either directly or indirectly. Let's talk about the grand spectacles, the religious festivals. These were massive affairs, held in honor of different gods throughout the year. There were festivals dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and Tlaloc, the rain god. And these festivals weren't just a time for feasts and dancing. They were serious affairs where sacrifices, often human, were made to honor the gods. Historians often debate how much of this was symbolic and how much was a true necessity for the Aztecs. Some believe these festivals were mostly about asserting the power of the emperor and the priesthood, while others suggest that the Aztecs truly believed their survival depended on the gods' favor. Either way, the scale and intricacy of the ceremonies were awe-inspiring. There were sacred dances, offerings of food and precious goods, and yes, human sacrifices performed by priests who had been specially trained for these rituals. In the heart of the city, the Templo Mayor loomed over everything. A massive, pyramid-shaped temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. This temple was the epicenter of Aztec religious life, and it stood as a constant reminder of the gods' importance. At the top of the temple, the priests would carry out the sacrifices, often performing elaborate rituals where they would slice open the chest of a captured warrior and offer the still-beating heart to the gods. If you were a visitor to Tenochtitlan, the sight of the Templo Mayor alone would be enough to take your breath away. The vast stone structure, towering over the city, was adorned with intricate carvings and bright paints. The sounds of ritual chants would fill the air, accompanied by the rhythmic drumming of the priests. You might have felt both awe and dread in equal measure as you watched the priests carry out their solemn duties. You would have been keenly aware that the fate of the empire, and perhaps even your own, was tied to these rituals. It wasn't just during the grand festivals that religion played a part in daily life. Smaller rituals took place every day, often tied to food and other basic activities. Before eating, the Aztecs would often make offerings to the gods, praying for their safety and prosperity. Even the food itself was treated with reverence, like the sacred tlaxcali, corn cakes, or xocoatl, chocolate, which were used in religious ceremonies as offerings to the gods. Historians argue whether these daily rituals helped maintain social order, or if they were simply part of the Aztecs' religious devotion. Some believe that the constant reminders of the gods in everyday life helped keep people obedient and focused on the needs of the empire, while others argue that they provided a genuine spiritual outlet for the Aztec people. Either way, religion was the lens through which the Aztecs saw the world, and it was deeply woven into every aspect of their lives. But there was also a more personal side to religion in Aztec society. While the gods demanded great sacrifices, they also offered protection, fortune, and favor in return. Individuals could seek divine assistance by offering prayers and sacrifices, but the greatest act of devotion was to serve the gods through the imperial system. As a commoner, you would participate in local religious rituals and festivals. But if you were chosen to be part of the Eagle Warrior class, or even the priesthood, your life would be dedicated entirely to the service of the gods. You might also have a personal shrine to one of the many gods, offering prayers and small sacrifices to ensure your well-being and success. One of the most important aspects of Aztec religion was the understanding of the cycles of life. The Aztecs believed that the universe was constantly being destroyed and recreated, and that this cycle needed to be maintained through rituals. The gods were constantly battling forces of darkness and chaos, and the role of humanity was to keep them fed and strong through sacrifice and devotion. This view of the world created a sense of urgency in every aspect of Aztec life. You couldn't afford to wait. You had to act, serve, and sacrifice before the gods became displeased. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs truly believed their survival depended on the constant appeasing of the gods, or whether these rituals were designed to maintain political control. Some believe that the emphasis on sacrifice and rituals helped create a sense of unity and discipline in the empire, while others see it as a form of manipulation, a tool used by the priests and the elite to maintain their power. Regardless of the motivations behind it, the religious life in the Aztec Empire was all-consuming. Even the simplest actions, eating, sleeping, working, were all performed with the gods in mind. You would walk through the streets of Tenochtitlan, surrounded by carvings of gods, incense-filled air, and the constant sounds of chanting, drumming, and ritual. Every day would be a reminder of the gods' power and your role in the cosmic order. As we dive deeper into the essence of the Aztec Empire, let's take a closer look at one of its most defining features, the imperial capital, Tenochtitlan. This sprawling city, set on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, was the beating heart of the Aztec Empire. From its towering temples and vast marketplaces to its intricate canals and bridges, Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineering, culture, and power. But it wasn't just a city. It was a symbol of the Aztec Empire's greatness, and a testament to their ability to merge nature, religion, and civilization. Imagine arriving in Tenochtitlan for the first time. From the moment you step onto one of the causeways that connect the city to the mainland, you'd be struck by the sheer scale and beauty of the place. The city's canals, lined with reed boats, would be the first thing to catch your eye. These canals acted as the city's highways, and they allowed the Aztecs to navigate the water as easily as we walk on land. Everything in the city flowed with purpose, from the water to the markets, where merchants from across the empire gathered to trade goods like cocoa, feathers, and jewelry. The city's centerpiece was, of course, the Templo Mayor, a towering pyramid that reached into the sky like a colossal monument to the gods. At the top of the temple, priests performed sacrifices, offering blood to the gods to ensure the sun would rise again, and that the cosmos would remain in balance. The temple was not just a religious center. It was a symbol of the empire's dominance, both over the land and the people. The pyramids and temples of Tenochtitlan were visible from nearly every corner of the city, reminding everyone of the power of the gods and the emperor. Historians still debate how the Aztecs managed to build such a massive city in the middle of a lake. Some believe they used floating gardens, known as chinampas, to cultivate crops on the water surface. Others argue that the Aztecs employed advanced engineering techniques to create artificial islands. But regardless of how they did it, Tenochtitlan was a technological marvel. Its urban planning, with its grid-like streets and centralized marketplaces, would have been impressive even by modern standards. The city was a microcosm of Aztec society, where everything from the people's homes to their religious practices was designed to reinforce the empire's power and control. But as awe-inspiring as Tenochtitlan was, it was also a city of contradictions. While it was a hub of art, culture, and trade, it was also a place where people lived under the constant threat of violence and war. The Aztecs' success was built on the backs of conquered peoples, and many of the city's inhabitants were either prisoners of war or their descendants. These conquered peoples were used to maintain the empire's massive workforce, providing labor for everything from agriculture to construction. The city's population was a mix of nobility, commoners, slaves, and prisoners, and life in Tenochtitlan was as hierarchical as the empire itself. One of the most striking features of the city was its bustling marketplaces. The Tlatelolco market was one of the largest in the world at the time, with goods from all corners of the empire, including textiles, spices, and exotic animals. Merchants set up their booths along the streets, and traders shouted out their wares in a cacophony of sounds. The market was a hub of economic activity, and it served as the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan. But even here, the influence of the gods could be felt. Traders made offerings before they began their work, ensuring that their transactions would be blessed and prosperous. Yet, for all its grandeur, Tenochtitlan was a place built on violence. It was a city that thrived on conquest, and its success depended on the constant flow of prisoners to be sacrificed to the gods. The Aztec Empire was built through warfare, and the people of Tenochtitlan were no strangers to bloodshed. Whether in battle or sacrifice, the act of spilling blood was seen as an essential part of maintaining the balance of the universe. Every war, every victory, every ritual was tied to the gods, and the people of the city played their part in ensuring that the sun would rise, the rains would come, and the earth would remain in harmony. Historians argue whether Tenochtitlan was a utopia of engineering and culture, or a grim symbol of imperialism and sacrifice. Some view it as a testament to the Aztecs' ingenuity and creativity, while others see it as a city built on the backs of the conquered. Either way, it was undeniably a hub of power and influence, and it represented the very essence of Aztec society, an empire built on religion, war, and a complex understanding of the natural world. As you wander the streets of Tenochtitlan, you'd feel the weight of the empire pressing down on you, even as you marveled at the beauty and complexity of the city. You'd hear the sounds of the market, the rhythm of life, and the occasional cries of a prisoner being led to his sacrifice. It's a world that's both awe-inspiring and terrifying, beautiful and brutal all at once. And in the heart of it all, the Templo Mayor stands tall, watching over the city, reminding you of the god's constant presence in every moment of your life. As we near the end of your journey through the Aztec Empire, it's time to look at the thing that ultimately brought the empire to its knees, the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. But before you get all excited about swords and armor, let's take a moment to understand how the Aztecs, the mighty conquerors of Mesoamerica, were brought to their end by a small band of foreign invaders. The story isn't just about better technology or ruthless warfare. It's about cultural misunderstanding, the fragility of power, and the sheer luck that gave the Spanish their opening. The first Spanish expedition to reach the Aztec Empire was led by Hernán Cortés in 15E. Initially, the Aztecs had no reason to suspect that the Spanish were anything other than another group of traders or travelers. Cortés and his men didn't look like an invading force. They didn't have the massive armies or religious iconography that the Aztecs were used to. Instead, the Spanish came with armor, horses, and firearms, things that were completely unfamiliar to the Aztecs. But the most significant advantage the Spanish had wasn't in their technology. It was their ability to manipulate local politics and alliances. When Cortés arrived on the coast, he was met by a messenger from the Aztec Emperor, Montezuma II. Montezuma had heard of the gods arriving from the east, and he was curious about them. His interpretation of this prophecy led him to believe that the Spanish might be divine beings. In the most dramatic twist of fate, Montezuma sent gifts to the Spanish and invited them into his capital city, Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs, used to receiving gifts from neighboring cities, didn't realize that their diplomatic hospitality would set the stage for their downfall. Historians still debate why Montezuma treated the Spanish with such deference. Some believe it was because he genuinely thought they were gods, while others argue that he was simply trying to buy time or appease them. Either way, Cortés and his men were given a warm welcome, and they quickly took advantage of the situation. Cortés and his forces managed to establish alliances with various enemies of the Aztecs, including the Tlaxcalans, who were bitter rivals of Montezuma's empire. These alliances gave the Spanish a crucial advantage, both in terms of manpower and intelligence. By the time the Spanish reached Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were already divided. While the elite might have been impressed by the Spanish, the commoners were more wary. Many of them resented the harsh demands of the empire, the constant tribute, and the threat of war and sacrifice. The Spanish quickly capitalized on this resentment, offering the commoners a chance to join their cause. This strategy, combined with the Spanish weapons and horses, led to the eventual fall of Tenochtitlan. But there's one more twist to this story: the role of disease. Smallpox, brought by the Spanish, decimated the Aztec population. The disease spread rapidly, killing thousands of people, including many of the Aztec warriors. The city, that had once seemed invincible, was now a shadow of its former self, crippled by illness and unable to defend itself effectively. Cortés, seeing the city's weakened state, laid siege to Tenochtitlan, and after months of fighting, the Aztecs finally surrendered. Some historians argue that the fall of the Aztec Empire was inevitable, given the tensions that had built up within the empire and the Spanish's military advantage. Others suggest that the arrival of the Spanish was a stroke of luck, a coincidence that could have easily been avoided if Montezuma had acted differently, or if the Aztecs had been more united. Either way, what's clear is that the Spanish were able to topple an empire that had existed for centuries with just a handful of men. And this remains one of the most stunning examples of military history. The fall of the Aztec Empire marked the end of an era for Mesoamerica, and it set the stage for the Spanish conquest of the entire continent. The consequences of this event are still felt today in the culture, history, and identities of the peoples of Mexico and Central America. For the Aztecs, however, it was the beginning of the end, a tragic and ironic downfall of an empire built on power, sacrifice, and cosmic order. Now, after all that bloodshed, cultural manipulation, and conquest, you're left wondering, could you have survived in the Aztec Empire? Would you have been a noble, a warrior, or a priest? Or would you have fallen victim to the brutality of their worldview? One thing's for sure, you'd have to be incredibly lucky, or incredibly brutal, to make it through the demands of the empire without being sacrificed or swept away in the constant tide of war and politics. But maybe that's the point. The Aztec Empire was a civilization of contrasts, brilliant in its art, culture, and science, but brutal in its warfare and religious practices. It was a society where death and life existed in an eternal cycle, where gods demanded blood, and where the people were constantly reminded that their place in the world was dictated by forces far beyond their control. And in the end, that's what made the Aztec Empire so fascinating and so tragic. As you sit with the aftermath of the fall of the Aztec Empire, let's now take a step back and explore the lasting legacy the Aztecs left behind. While their empire crumbled beneath the weight of foreign conquest, their culture, innovations, and ideas didn't simply vanish into history. In fact, much of what we know about the Aztecs and their way of life is still influencing modern society today. One of the most notable legacies of the Aztec Empire is the vast wealth of knowledge they left in the form of their writings and codices. The Aztecs were an advanced civilization with an incredible understanding of agriculture, astronomy, and medicine. They recorded their knowledge in a form of picture writing called pictographs and codices, which were made from bark, paper, or animal skins. These codices were filled with detailed illustrations of gods, rituals, ceremonies, and daily life. While much of this written knowledge was destroyed during the Spanish conquest, a few surviving codices have provided modern scholars with a glimpse into Aztec culture, religion, and administration. Their knowledge of agriculture was another monumental achievement. The Aztecs were masters of farming techniques, developing complex systems like the chinampa, artificial islands built on the water where crops could be grown year-round. These floating gardens were used to grow everything from maize to chilies, and they helped support the large population of Tenochtitlan. The ingenuity of the chinampa system is still admired today, especially when you consider how the Aztecs were able to feed a city of hundreds of thousands with limited land resources. Moreover, the Aztecs made remarkable advancements in medicine. They had an extensive understanding of herbal remedies and used plants like Tenochtitlan, a hallucinogenic mushroom, and coca, to treat a range of ailments. Their use of surgery, particularly in trepanation, the practice of drilling holes into the skull, indicates a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy. Even more astonishing is their approach to public health. The Aztecs understood the importance of hygiene and water management, as evidenced by the complex waterworks systems they developed to bring fresh water into Tenochtitlan, and the establishment of public baths to promote cleanliness. The Aztecs were also skilled craftsmen and artisans, creating stunning works of art in everything from pottery and textiles to jewelry and sculptures. They were particularly known for their intricate gold work, and many of their gold objects, ranging from jewelry to ceremonial objects, were taken by the Spanish during their conquest. However, enough has survived to give us an understanding of their artistic vision. Aztec artists often worked with gold, jade, and turquoise, creating pieces that were both functional and symbolic. These pieces are now highly prized by collectors and museums worldwide. Despite their eventual fall, the Aztecs had a lasting influence on the people who came after them. The Mexican and Central American cultures that followed the Aztec Empire were heavily shaped by Aztec customs, language, and traditions. The Nahuatl language, which was spoken by the Aztecs, is still spoken by millions of people today in Mexico. Many modern-day words, especially those related to food, like tomato, chocolate, and avocado, come directly from the Nahuatl language. The artistic and architectural legacy of the Aztecs is also apparent. While much of the grand city of Tenochtitlan was destroyed by the Spanish, the ruins of the Templo Mayor and other significant structures still stand as a reminder of the Aztecs' architectural mastery. Modern Mexico City is built on the site of Tenochtitlan, and remnants of the ancient city can still be seen today, such as the Templo Mayor ruins and the National Museum of Anthropology, which houses many Aztec artifacts. Historians still debate the degree to which the Spanish conquest erased Aztec culture. Some argue that the Aztecs were nearly wiped out, with their customs and practices suppressed or destroyed by the Spanish. Others suggest that while the empire fell, much of the culture endured through syncretism, the blending of Aztec traditions with European practices. The Day of the Dead, for example, is a celebration rooted in Aztec beliefs, where the living honor their ancestors with offerings, food, and decorations. Today, it's a widespread celebration in Mexico and among Mexican communities worldwide. The Aztecs' contribution to agriculture, medicine, and art was more than just practical. It was symbolic. Their deep connection to the land, the gods, and the cycles of life and death permeated every aspect of their civilization. The fact that these legacies continue to influence modern society speaks volumes about the resilience and depth of Aztec culture. While the empire may have fallen, the imprint it left on history remains indelible. In the end, the Aztec Empire wasn't just a civilization defined by warfare and ritual. It was a culture that valued knowledge, creativity, and a deep connection to the natural world. If you were lucky enough to be born under the right circumstances, you might have thrived in this vibrant, if tumultuous, society. If not, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't last long in the unforgiving, high-stakes world of the Aztecs. As we come to the final chapter of your journey through the Aztec Empire, let's reflect on the paradoxes of this great civilization. The Aztecs, with their stunning achievements and brutal practices, left behind a legacy that is both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Their empire thrived for centuries, carving out a civilization that was ahead of its time in many ways. Yet it was brought down by a combination of luck, disease, and human frailty. At its height, the Aztec Empire was one of the most powerful and advanced societies in the Americas. Their understanding of agriculture, architecture, medicine, and art set them apart from other civilizations of the time. The Aztecs were masters of irrigation, creating vast systems of canals and floating gardens to support their growing population. They had a sophisticated understanding of the stars and the movements of the planets, which they used to guide their agricultural practices and religious rituals. Their cities were marvels of engineering, with towering temples and complex marketplaces that drew traders from across the world. But for all their achievements, the Aztecs were also a civilization built on violence. They relied on conquest and sacrifice to maintain their empire. Their armies were fierce, and their religious practices were often brutal, with human sacrifice at the center of many rituals. The Aztecs believed that the gods needed to be appeased with blood, and this belief led them to perform elaborate ceremonies in which prisoners of war were sacrificed, their hearts cut out and offered to the gods. It was a society where life and death were inextricably linked, and where the gods were constantly demanding tribute. Historians still debate the true nature of the Aztec Empire. Was it a sophisticated society that simply had a different worldview? Or was it a violent, oppressive regime built on fear and subjugation? Some see the Aztecs as a deeply spiritual people, connected to the natural world and the cosmos in ways we can only begin to understand. Others see them as a brutal empire, using religion and warfare as tools to maintain control over their subjects. In the end, it's clear that the Aztec Empire was a complex, multifaceted civilization that defies easy categorization. Despite their many accomplishments, the Aztecs couldn't escape the fate that awaited them. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they brought with them more than just weapons and horses. They brought diseases like smallpox, which devastated the Aztec population. The combination of European diseases, internal divisions, and the Spanish military advantage led to the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, bringing an end to the Aztec Empire. The fall of the Aztecs is one of the most dramatic and tragic events in world history. It marked the end of a powerful civilization that had lasted for centuries, and the beginning of a new era of colonialism and exploitation in the Americas. The Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, took advantage of the Aztecs' internal divisions and alliances with other indigenous groups, eventually defeating the empire with a small but highly effective force. The destruction of Tenochtitlan and the subsequent conquest of the Aztec Empire changed the course of history, paving the way for the Spanish colonization of much of the Americas. But even in their defeat, the Aztecs left a lasting impact. Their culture, art, and knowledge were not completely erased by the Spanish. Many aspects of Aztec society survived through syncretism, blending their traditions with those of the Spanish. The Day of the Dead, for example, is a celebration that stems directly from Aztec beliefs about the afterlife. Aztec art and architecture can still be seen in Mexico today, and the Aztec language, Nahuatl, is still spoken by millions of people. The legacy of the Aztecs endures in ways that the conquerors could never have imagined. As you sit back and reflect on the empire you've just explored, it's clear that the Aztecs were a people of incredible contradiction. They built a mighty empire that was at once brilliant and brutal, creative and destructive. Their worldview was unique and complex, shaped by a deep connection to the gods and the cosmos, yet also by the harsh realities of survival and power. And while their empire may have fallen, their influence continues to echo through history. Now, as the sun sets on this journey through the Aztec Empire, it's hard not to think about what could have been. What if the Aztecs had survived the Spanish conquest? What kind of empire would they have built in the modern world? Could they have continued to thrive, or would they have eventually succumbed to their own contradictions? The answers to these questions remain unknown, but one thing is certain. The Aztecs were a civilization that shaped the course of history, and their legacy will continue to be studied, debated, and admired for centuries to come. So, as you drift off to sleep, think about the Aztec Empire, not just as a violent, powerful civilization, but as a people who lived in a world where everything, from war to sacrifice, was governed by the gods. Theirs was a world where time was cyclical, where life and death were intertwined, and where the rhythm of existence was dictated by the cosmic order. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of worldview we could learn from today, one where the divine and the mundane are never too far apart. Sweet dreams. If you ever want to journey through more histories or explore new worlds, I'll be here waiting. Rest well.